Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me in such a wonderful event. I think I'm going to try to shed some light on a rather different aspect of what urban crisis is called in the title of this workshop. So my talk today concerns the intertwinement of crisis and critique, or rather, the question of thinking critically in times of crisis, especially if we take into consideration that critical thought is, by definition, thought in crisis. It is about interrogating the terms which determine what counts as an ontological claim. In other words, critique is about provoking crisis to establish truth claims, including the truth claims of crisis. In this sense, I'm particularly interested in how the crisis calls for a critical re-engagement with and a critical reimagining of the political. Most significantly, I'm interested in how the crisis poses the questions of what counts as political, who counts as part of the public, how the political is performed and re-performed, and where and how it takes place, where and how it is embodied. I want to start then by invoking Judith Butler's engagement with Michel Foucault's well-known essay, What is Critique? And here's what Foucault says about critique. Critique will be the art of voluntary insubordination, that of reflected intractability. Critique would essentially ensure the desubjugation of the subject in the context of what we would call, in a word, the politics of truth. And Judith Butler responds to that by writing, but if that self-forming is done in disobedience to the principles by which one is formed, then virtue becomes the practice by which the self forms itself in desubjugation, which is to say that it risks its deformation as a subject, occupying that ontologically insecure position which poses the question anew: who will be a subject here, and what will count as a life? A moment of ethical questioning which requires that we break the habits of judgment in favor of a riskier practice that seeks to yield artistry from constraint. To echo Judith Butler's formulation here, I would like to argue that what is at stake in current regimes of crisis is precisely a contested domain where subjects risk their deformation as subjects, occupy ontologically insecure positions, and at the same time yield artistry from constraint. So, on the one side, crisis becomes a dispositif of power through which precarious and disposable populations are produced according to established norms of capital, gender, sexuality, and ethnicity. And on the other side, the possibility for reclaiming the terms of a livable, or not merely livable, life emerges. Life, which is always already a dispositif of biopower, can be performatively expropriated by subjugated groups and turned into a dispositif of protest. In this sense, current crisis recalls long-standing questions about different paradigms of power and resistance. As Giorgio Agamben writes, the concept of crisis has indeed, this is not the whole citation here, but doesn't matter, the concept crisis has indeed become a motto of modern politics. For a long time now, it has been part of normality in any segment of social life. Today, crisis has become an instrument of rule. It serves to legitimize political and economic decisions that in fact dispossess citizens and deprive them of any possibility of decision. And he continues, this unending crisis, just like a state of emergency, is incompatible with democracy. Indeed, what we are confronting here is the biopolitics of indefinite and unending crisis, as an instrument of neoliberal governmentality. In the analytics of power developed by Michel Foucault, if sovereignty seeks to rule on death, biopolitics is about administering life through managing surplus populations. Crisis then becomes an assemblage of power which both manages life and exposes to death. The archives of intelligibility and normative intimacy emerging from such configuration are defined by exclusionary norms of gender, capital, and nation. But if precariousness defines and differentiates the terms of our vulnerability, there remains an interminable call for another vulnerability and for another politics of vulnerability, which will no longer be premised upon the governmental matrix of biopolitics, thanatopolitics, and will mobilize the potentiality of reclaiming the terms of a livable life. As the neoliberal governance is being established as the dominant imaginary all over our globalized world, at the same time, new radical movements are emerging in different parts of the world, as well as different topologies where these movements are being performed. The massive spread of induced precarity inaugurated a period of intense collective mobilization and protest in Greece as well as elsewhere. Despite the authoritative efforts to produce a single and monolithic narrative of crisis and national salvation, without alternatives and without heterodoxies, people have been seeking to counteract the sense of helplessness through engaging in a plurality of local projects of protest, solidarity, self-determination, and alternative social economies. During the spring and summer of 2011, thousands of people took to the streets in Athens and other major cities across the country in daily occupations and mass rallies under the slogan "True Democracy Now." Indeed, some of the street demonstrations were the most widespread since the end of the dictatorship of 1967-1974. Many protesters set up tents and camped in Syntagma Square, the central square of Athens and most prominent public space opposite the parliament, creating a space for peaceful public dissent and reclaiming democracy from corporate power. People's assemblies were regularly held in the square, as well as public debates and protests related to a wide spectrum of political concerns, such as the debt crisis and economic justice, the right to the city and the right to congregate, democracy and market-driven democratization, the confiscation of public goods, sexism and homophobia, alternatives to the austerity measures, international solidarity, and more. Solidarity kitchens, a pharmacy, collective cleaning, concerts, and films were also organized. Indignation was gradually transformed into a peaceful uprising against the unjust and autocratic measures imposed by the IMF, EU, and European Central Bank, with the full accord and complicity of the Greek government. In this sense, as present neoliberal regimes increasingly exposed to death through differential exposure to the injuries of poverty, demoralization, and racism, a performative politics of protest emerges, one which mobilizes the radical potentiality of transforming such injurious interpellations. Assembled bodies in the street reclaim the unconditionality of public space, demanding a democracy with demos and enacting a demos with differences. Please note here the dual implication of the phrase bodies in the street, encompassing both the condition of losing a home due to seizure or eviction, and the participation in events of public protest. In both registers, public space is embodied and bodied forth through geometries of power. And I think an emblematic scene from this genealogy of bodies in the street assembling in the public space is this image which shows a policeman chasing specters of Marx, as you can see, embodied as protesters against the marketization of higher education. As you know, many European and some US cities have been recently pulsating with massive protests at their universities against the cost of tuition, against regimes of university governance, and against the corporatization of higher education. One of the most striking modes of protest was what was called the book block, in which protesters marched wearing book shields in the streets of Rome, London, and other cities in defense of public universities and libraries. So this is an image that epitomizes the spirit or the specter of our time. A policeman raises his baton against the protester who carries a book sign of Jacques Derrida's Spectres of Marx. This image of an armed policeman chasing the unarmed spectres of Marx reminds us that those recurring spectres still haunt capitalism. It reminds us, above all, that sometimes, again and again, we have to fight for our books with our books. And this struggle to defend the public university is an ongoing struggle in Athens and in Greece, and it's still very vivid today, in these days in Athens. So, bodies in the street as modalities of engaging critically with a crisis are also brought to presence through street art, like political graffiti and performance art. The crisis has inspired a flourishing community of graffiti artists and performance artists, whose performance works as a political praxis and critical commentary on the Greek crisis. In a context where funding for cultural life has dried up or even completely disappeared, artists become activists. Artivists is a new word that has emerged from this situation. Now, one such example is another performance. Is Mary Zigouris' Liquidations. It's a performance which took place in different places in Europe. This picture is from Rome, 2011. As you can see, the artist carries a huge amount of sacks in the city streets, and heading each time to a particular destination. In Rome, she tried to reach a pawn shop in order to put her belongings in pledge. A crowd of interested or curious bystanders followed her in a move which recast the question of collective identification and praxis of reclaiming public space in the face of crisis. This creative tension between, on the one side, the differential distribution and regulation of the terms of precariousness as an instrument of neoliberal governmentality, and on the other side, the struggle to reclaim the terms of life without erasing vulnerability, is precisely what I would call precarious intensity. Precarious intensity implies an agonistic instead of antagonistic way of attending to vulnerability. An agonistic engagement which often takes place within a contested public space, within a contested realm of embodying public space. In the ongoing 5-year debt crisis and austerity policy in Greece, a protest sphere has been forming and persisting. As people are forcefully relegated by the market logic to subjugated subjects and disposable bodies with no rights, new modes of agonistic embodied citizenship have been emerging, through which challenges to neoliberal policies have been posed. The current regimes of crisis provide the grounds for a critical re-engagement with who counts as part of the public, how the political is performed, what qualifies as political subjectivity, and how this political subjectivity is gendered, racialized, and classed. So in order to trace these precarious intensities on the streets and squares of Greece, I would like to pose these questions. How are bodies subjugated and desubjugated in these times of neoliberal governmentality and precarization? How do they endure, protest, persist, and resist? How are they brought to presence, and how do they make themselves present? What are the gendered, ethno-racialized, and classed intensities of enacting bodily practices of resistance and public protest? How do bodies, subjects, and collectivities come into play in protesting neoliberalism? A modality, a very specific modality of power that forecloses the ontological and epistemic conditions of possibility for contesting it. In light of this questioning, I would like to argue that neoliberalism is not just a mode of capitalist financialization in the strict sense, but also a more encompassing and diffuse regime of biopolitical neoconservatism. Neoliberal governmentality denotes an authoritative apparatus of producing dispensable and disposable populations, and at the same time producing and demarcating the normative codes of the human by regulating the affectivity, potentiality, embodiment, vulnerability, and livability of subjects. Within the purview of this governmentality, the biopolitical administration of life and death is reinvented and reconfigured as resources and vulnerability are differently and unevenly distributed among different bodies, differently racialized, gendered, and classed bodies. As indebtedness becomes a crucial technology of biopolitical governmentality, and crisis management turns into a political and moral economy of life itself, liberalization of the markets and tough austerity measures for the people are intertwined with the political agenda of law and order, aimed at the preemptive and punitive management of public discontent through the logics of social normalization and securitization. Thus, steep economic disparities and deprivation, the normalization of poverty, and the widespread condition of precarity are combined with new forms of securitization, such as tightened migration policies, the abjection of those without papers and illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, as well as an intensified politics of racism, sexism, and homophobia. Economic hardship and austerity measures required under the bailout, loss of jobs, pay cuts, disposable labor, unemployment, poverty, loss of dignity, and the dissolution of the public healthcare system are attended by an overall conservative backlash. Emergency legislation is deployed to curtail rights. A citizenship law repeals citizenship rights for second-generation migrants and increases the number of years of residence and schooling that the children of immigrants need to prove before they are eligible to apply for citizenship. Preemptive civil mobilization orders are issued to prevent and criminalize strikes, and the police detains trans people in order to clean and beautify the city, as it happened recently in Thessaloniki. Now, when it comes to bodies on the streets, however, it is critical that we bear in mind that it is not only the left that is taking to the streets against precarious conditions today in Europe, but also occasionally segments of the right and even of the far right, with the neo-Nazi part rising rapidly in popularity for its anti-immigrant stance. The government enforces tightened immigration policies in Athens, including roundups, detentions and deportations of undocumented migrants, but also other groups constructed as dangerous and polluting. A critical moment in this genealogy, in the genealogy of the Greek neoliberal biopolitics, evoked the objected figure of the HIV-positive foreigner woman as an apparatus of securitization and normalization in times of precipitous cuts to welfare and healthcare programs. On December 15, 2011, the Greek Minister of Health had stated that HIV-infected female migrant sex workers should be deported from the country because, I quote, "the infection goes from the undocumented migrant women to the Greek male customer into the Greek family," unquote. In May 2012, a few days ahead of the national legislative election and amid opinion polls showing a sharp decline in support for the two major parties, so-called Social Democratic PASOK and conservative right-wing New Democracy, while support for previously minor left-wing Syriza coalition of the radical left party seemed to surge, Greek authorities announced the arrest of 17 HIV-positive women who allegedly worked illegally as sex workers, accusing them of, I quote, intentionally causing grievous bodily harm, unquote. Health authorities announced that most of these women from Greece and Eastern Europe were addicted to drugs and doing sex work in order to raise the money for their fixes. The names and photographs of most of them were published on the Greek police's website in violation of human rights and medical confidentiality. The mugshots, widely released to the news media and reprinted by several websites, were accompanied by scaremongering stories about the respectful Greek married family men who could have been infected. The decision to make public the photographs of those women alleged to have tested positive for HIV fueled a public outcry, especially among rights movements, feminist and anti-racist groups, and social networking sites. However, both Health Minister and Citizens Protection Minister, another euphemism, Citizens Protection Minister, both prominent members of the National Unity Interim Government of Lukas Papadimos, the Government of National Salvation, defended the decision, stating that the protection of public health overrides all other concerns. The implication was that all violence directed at mastering the perceived threat was absolutely justified. The public demonstrations and protests spurred by that governmental action focused on exposing and criticizing the co-implicated neoliberal, racist and sexist modalities of power that transform certain lives into expendable. What those protests clearly illustrated was precisely the crucial affinity of market economy to a subjectivating economy of the othered and precarized body exercised through power technologies of security and normalization. Anthropologist Jean Komarov has insightfully theorized the inherent tendency of neoliberal capitalism to depend on the production of moral panics. At a time when the social welfare state is collapsing in Greece and a sizable segment of the population does not have health insurance and access to health care, at a time of government cuts on health care and services, including those related to HIV prevention and care, the health minister set the norms of technocratic therapeutics by targeting HIV-positive women as a public health bomb, as it was called. That is, as abject, medicalized bodies to be properly monitored and managed for the sake of the nation's sanitation, safety, purity, and the like. In the era of neoliberal biopolitics, the protection of public good, which infuses discourses of governance, entails instigating fear, entrenching social stigma, producing superfluous figures of public enemy, and humiliating those classified as pariahs of the political and moral economies of our late liberal times. In this political imagination, in the neoliberal political imagination, this abjected, medicalized body of alien woman, cast as dangerously precarious, becomes again and again the instrumentalized vehicle for setting the normative preconditions of living and belonging that work to immunize and securitize the body politic. To conclude then, what all of these aspects of crisis illustrate is that the neoliberal governmentality interpellates us today as subjects of market sovereignty, impoverished subjects of dispossession and shame, subjects of competitive economic struggle for survival, but also as precarious subjects and subjects of gendered violence and injustice. It is precisely this governmentality of crisis that becomes a performative occasion for Donna Haraway has called the insurrection, sorry, that's another quote, for what Michel Foucault has called the insurrection of subjugated knowledges, and the emergence of political subjectivities which account for the relationship between vulnerability, precariousness, injustice, and protest. In avowing and politically mobilizing their shared vulnerability, bodies and spaces of protest are pulled outside of their taken for grantedness. They call into question the normative matrices that prescribe the space of action and forestall or constrain the possibility of acting otherwise. I would suggest that through the persistent performative force of this concerted activity of dissent or desubjugation, they drive neoliberalism into crisis, and they drive neoliberalism as well as its constitutive affinity to norms of gender, sexuality, nationality, raciality, able-bodiedness, land and capital ownership, all this assemblage that would be called neoliberalism. This can be potentially driven into crisis. Such precarious intensities signal, I think, an openness to alternative modes of becoming with one another from the perspective of a performative politics of reclaiming the terms of public spaces and livable lives. Thank you very much.